Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is.
Mmabatho Montse. I am based in Tshwane, otherwise known as Pretoria, South Africa. I wouldn't say I'm a researcher, but I am currently pursuing doctoral research that is aligned to my calling and I suppose my entire life purpose. Because when I look back, I see that I've had the same core values, and that is what has propelled me even deeper into this journey of self-understanding. I've had an experience of being an outlier for all my life. And so that otherness, that unbelonging has, from a very young age, pushed me towards understanding life in a bit more complex and deeper ways. And my initiation into the Nguni traditions of Ubungoma, meaning shamanism, has, I think, or have deepened my desire to understand myself beyond the material and beyond the social conditioning, which I clearly struggle with. I think of myself as a bit of a rebel because I struggle with the current authorities. I struggle with how the system is for many reasons. And so that's a bit about me.
Wow, and that raises so many questions. I feel as though I don't even need to ask my normal opening one about what's currently troubling you or dynamizing you. But I wondered if I could follow up on one thing in particular. There are so many things in what you said that are fascinating. And that is the sense of being a bit of an outlier, an outsider, of not belonging. Obviously, I'm not asking you to say anything more autobiographical than you wish, right? But I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that, because that's a sensation that some people have when they come from a family of 10, and some people have when they have no family. It's something that can be very much conditioned by circumstance, yeah? Or it can be something else. It might be about politics, it might be about family, it might be about one's own psychology. So I wonder if you could just elaborate on that point a wee bit for us.
Yeah, and I'll I'll answer the question, what is bothering me, because it is directly connected to my own otherness and how I've experienced life.
Hmm.
So in my quest to understand myself, I recently went on a trip to Botswana, where my maternal great grandmother was from. She was from the Basarwa people, which are otherwise known as the Khoisan, the hunter-gatherers, the first people in Southern Africa. And so I was turning 36 and I decided to go on this ancestral pilgrimage.
Yeah.
And I went to the deep villages in Botswana because that is where she was from. And being with the community of the Basarwa people just broke my heart. They have been marginalized. They have been violently abused by a Black leadership, right? So Botswana has been independent for many years right now, but the indigenous people of Botswana are living in very dire circumstances. Young girls, ages of between 13 and 16, having at least two children. They don't have, many of them don't have running water. They cannot afford to pay for running water. They've been forced to stop living how they used to live. The government and the people see them as a problem, and it reminds me of how apartheid functioned in South Africa. And apartheid is directly connected to my own experiences, right? So
Hmm.
what colonization has done to African families, to Black people, is not only material, but it has affected people at a very deep psychological and spiritual level. And so because of that, I find that many families are very dysfunctional. My mother died when I was 17. And having to live with family and seeing how one is othered within the family context because you are not so and so's child. Although in the African context, as a mother, every child is my child. And as a well and sane mother, I should have the capacity to treat each and every child with the same compassion I would extend to my own biological child, right? And so my own othering started from my own family. Before my mom died, I experienced sexual trauma. And I only remembered this early in my 30s after going to Vipassana, a 10-day silent meditation retreat. And I think many people have suppressed a lot of their own emotions and traumas because of their need to survive, right?
Yes.
And so we see this in how in the relationship people have got with substances, even with other cultural forms like consumption, fashion, materialism in general. So these are the different things have that have led me to explore the kind of work I'm exploring and to be so determined to live outside of the current system. I think the system is doing exactly what it has been designed to do. And so, from a post-activist perspective, I am choosing to focus my energies on my well-being and seeing how I can influence and create other systems and communities of care and of healing, and really creating different forms of education because, as you know, education has been very instrumental, in colonization, in capitalism, in knowledge production.
Absolutely. And I wonder if I could follow up on something related that connects to what I read on your website as well, which is that it seems to me what you've just described for us is a quest, a form of life that combines the deeply personal with the much broader political. So you've spoken about apartheid, you've written about decoloniality as part of what you do, at the same time as describing sexual trauma that you've experienced, or mentioning it, I should say, and also the sense of being excluded, and but then relating that to the experience of your family's own indigenous roots in Botswana and the oppression of those people. So I wanted to ask you, if I could, about the decoloniality bit and how that applies. Is that something that you sense every day, despite the independence of South Africa, for example, despite the independence of Botswana, in
Mm.
terms of both the enduring power of whiteness, but also in terms of what that power can do within Black communities themselves?
So I think, firstly, the West, America, America thinks of itself as the most powerful nation, right? But we look at them and what is happening now, and we see that whatever rhetoric around equality, freedom, democracy that has been punted over the years, the so-called freedom or democratic years, has really been fake, for lack of a better word. And places like South Africa are just examples of how that colonialism and ongoing colonization continue to affect nation states and leadership, right? You look at South Africa, we've been a democracy for 30 years, over 30 years, and the lives of ordinary Black people continue to just get worse. You look at the unemployment rates in South Africa, youth, we have over 50% of youth unemployed, right? And people are getting the degrees they're told to get. And so one needs to ask themselves, how come or how is it that a country that calls itself a democratic state still carries the kind of struggles that South Africa carries? So when one looks at colonization and how it has affected people, particularly those who call themselves leaders now, and how they think, I can clearly see that people are very much embedded. They have been, someone I know says there's a mind capture that is not being spoken about. And when I look at my history, I look at people like Steve Biko. I don't know how much you know about him, who was very passionate about Black consciousness. He was quickly taken out, right? Because he understood that the minds of Black people were far more important than the material accumulation. And so what colonization, colonialism, capitalism continues to do is to dangle lower carrots in front of people's faces and say, if you do this, if you play nice, if you play within the rules, you will get a particular life. But I see the middle class in South Africa continuing to struggle with debt, continuing to struggle with alcoholism, with abuse of all sorts of nature. The very same political leaders are often the ones who are perpetuating the blesser culture. Now, the blesser culture in South Africa is older men who have got more material accumulation, literally luring young women who want a better life into particular sort of like relationships, right?
Mm-hmm.
High level sort of prostitution in my view. And this is done by older men who were largely part of the struggle and who have got the monetary or economic power. Now you ask yourself, if a man who is old enough to be my father sexualizes me, and instead of trying to help me to advance as a young woman, there's a need for sexual relations and those kind of power dynamics. It just tells you the kind of people and the kind of leadership we have. And this is also very visible in the lack of developmental programs that help young Black people understand who they are outside of wanting success within a Western framework or reality, right? Where people don't necessarily desire to be like white people, but they want to be themselves and they're proud of who they are and they are able to really reach their potential. So there isn't that. And so that for me is one of my biggest gripes with today's leadership and politics with government. And I don't think it's any different from countries like Swaziland, which is also very close to South Africa. My mother was born in Lesotho. The people in Lesotho struggle a lot. Many of them are migrant workers here. Many of them, now we have an informal mining industry. Many of them are really finding themselves having to resort to those kind of ways of making money, of surviving, because our political leaders and their connected elites are circulating money and funds amongst themselves, and nobody really cares about the poor.
You mentioned Steve Biko. He was murdered, I think, thrown out of a window. Was that what happened eventually after being tortured? Have I got that right?
He was killed, yeah.
Yeah. I was an undergrad in college, and
Mhm,
he was a heroic figure for us.
mhm,
Uh, Absolutely heroic. I think we knew more about him than we knew about Mandela, actually. Um, and perhaps that was because obviously Mandela was silenced at the time, but also Biko was an intellectual and had these ideas about decolonizing the mind that really a lot of revolutionary African leaders had at the time. And it, I have strong memories of the South African embassy at that time. Was mid to late 70s, wasn't it? I'm just remembering.
mhm,
Having in its grounds hundreds of white crosses that protesters had put there. So not inside the embassy itself, but in the grasslands around it, which were public space, hundreds of white crosses placed, not necessarily by Christians, but as a
mhm,
sign of mortality, of death, of assassination, of torture, and so on, in honor of Biko, with the names of people who died at Sharpeville, for instance, 15 or 16 years earlier, and so on. And so when you mention him, it I draws a very physical reaction from me of memory of those times. Now, one of the things that's interesting, you mentioned, in a sense, the thinness of US democracy. Of course, two of the people who are privileged at the moment were brought up by an Afrikaner world in South Africa, in Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. And as you also are aware, and many listeners will know, Donald Trump regards Afrikaners as an oppressed minority in South Africa and wants to give them a specialized refugee status. That's on one side. So I'd love your views on that. On the other, for many of us on the left, the South African government is heroic for one thing at the moment, its efforts to bring the state of Israel to justice for what is being done in Gaza. And I'd love to get your views on those two things if I could. And then I'd like to talk to you about shamanism and learn something from you on that. Is that okay as a way of proceeding?
yeah, yeah. I think the Afrikaners must take Donald Trump up on his offer, and they must go. Um, yeah, I think South Africans have been extremely kind to Afrikaners in this country. I think Afrikaners do not know what it means to be oppressed. And if young Black South Africans were to rise, they will then know what it means to be oppressed. Um, I think, I mean, we've got a place called Orania here in South Africa where white people have created their own community where they've built schools and facilities in the name of preserving their culture. And yet they do not see anything wrong with what has happened to the culture of Africans in South Africa.
Yeah.
There's someone that says, the oppressor, they don't really understand what oppression is, or when someone seeks the same freedoms as they do, they then feel like they're oppressed because their freedom is hinged on somebody else being subjugated and oppressed. And so I think Black South Africans have been very kind to white Afrikaners. And I think if young Black South Africans were to really awaken to their dreams and their potential that is continuing to be trampled on and killed, then we would really see an uprising in South Africa. I think Elon Musk and Donald Trump are both very wounded little white men. I think they're very fearful. I think with all the material accumulation they have, their politics and their way of thinking is so, I don't even think I've got a proper word of describing it. But when one looks at consciousness, right, and you look at how survival and needs work, despite them being some of the wealthiest people in the world, their needs, their sense of self is still so unsophisticated. I think the world gives them too much credit. Yes, their rhetoric is very dangerous, but for me, they're actually sick. They're very fearful. And when one looks at possibly the history of race and racism, I've looked at the works of Frances Cress Welsing. I don't know if you know her, who wrote about the theory of color and why certain white people are really afraid of Black people. I don't think she was far off. And when I look from a spiritual perspective, what fear-based belief systems do, I'm increasingly convinced that people who think like Donald Trump and Elon Musk need serious psychological and spiritual interventions. And so, yeah, that is really how I feel about them. And then in terms of South Africa, and its position around the Israel Gaza situation, I'm obviously, for that. However, I really believe the South African government has failed to address its own issues here in our country. How young Black people live. I've recently connected with my paternal family, and having to go to the village. My grandfather is almost 100 years old. He is strong. He doesn't need a walking stick to walk, right? But his children, who are between the ages of, let's just say 65 and 52, they are alcoholics. They are not fully functional adults. Now, something has obviously happened between when my grandfather was a youngster to how people in the village are. And the fact that our government has not done anything to address the psychological and spiritual well-being of our people, for me, that is a crime on its own.
Yeah.
You look at a person like Cyril Ramaphosa, who before, he became president, he was very much involved in unions. So he understands the struggles of the poor. He, I'm guessing, comes from a culturally rooted background, but to have no sense of what must be done to help Black South Africans recover from oppression, if I could, I would arrest them. I would charge them for human rights violations, because according to our culture, according to who we are as Africans, our identity does not begin with our physical being, and they should know that.
Now, taking this to the level of trying to deal with trauma, of finding a way of engaging in intergenerational healing, personal healing, and so on. This is one of the things that you specialize in. You describe yourself as a spherical guide, and you mentioned earlier shamanism, which is obviously a big deal here in Latin America, where I am. at present. And telling stories that are very telling is an important part of that. So I wondered if you could now share with us a wee bit of that practice of yours.
So I think what patriarchy has sought to do, or capitalism, is to really break people from who they are. I think, my history is still very young, as I mentioned. I'm 36, so there's a lot I'm still coming to understand, right?
Sure.
But when I look at religion, Christianity in particular, and I look at Western education, they have been used as tools to ensure people are fragmented. So with Christianity came the idea that people needed an intermediary to be connected to source. I won't use the word God. For people have got different understandings of who, a supreme being is, or who the creator is. But Christianity sought to create a separation or a divide between people and that source. And then education came with an approach of creating specializations or fields that make it seem as if though our entire life experience is removed from all the other disciplines, right? So as a spherical guide, I say we need to function as whole beings. Firstly, what is important to me is who I am at a spiritual level. And therefore, who I am as a spiritual level informs everything else I do, right? Now, if people do not understand that about themselves, then they will see their jobs, their relationships with their children or with their partners, their relationship with nature as separate and often not making sense or not being interconnected. Now we know with what is happening with the earth, with our climate, we can see that that is obviously not working. And all indigenous cultures have always understood that human beings are part of nature. And so even in the African context, our entire educational system was very much a part of our everyday life. Formal education, which often meant when as a young girl you start getting your period, you'd go through initiation, which meant a formal school where you would be prepared for certain roles because they understood that developmentally you are changing, and therefore you needed to be prepared for your new role. The same would happen after you've had your first child. And the same would happen for men. Men would go to initiation schools when they're of a particular age. I mean, boys, for circumcision, but it was not only circumcision. They were taught how to be men, what it means to be a husband, what it means to be a hunter or a provider, the role you play in your sister's daughter's life, right? The role you play as an uncle. And so we have got specific names for, like there's a name for my father's brother. He plays a very specific role in my life. There are certain rituals that he would be responsible for. And so our education in the African context was very much holistic.
It's very integrated.
Very integrated. Now, when one looks at the Western education and the Western education and its religion, it's very disconnected. And I think that is why people can call themselves Christians and yet do not espouse the values that Christ held.
Sorry, my cat is doing some terrible things to the hotel room. So the reason in between listening to what you're saying that I'm moving around and doing slightly odd things is that here he is. Say hello, darling. Yes, yes,
Hello. What's
yes.
his name?
Well, he has two names, Mmabatho. One is Chinguri, which is a
Chin.
Basque name, and the
Mhm.
other one is Naranja, which is just Spanish for orange, which is his color. And
Okay.
I'm very lucky in that the hotel lets him stay here with me. But he's currently in a sort of, speaking of what you were talking about with rituals, he's in an uncontrolled young man mode,
Ah,
a lot
okay.
of energy. So anyway, back to what you were saying. There is this integrated element, and what you're also saying is that your experience of Christianity and its influence is that frequently the, let's be honest, socialistic teachings of Christ are completely eviscerated in mainstream religion. I think that's fair to say. Yeah, it's quite obvious he was on the left in the terms we would use today, right? Um,
Exactly.
Now, related to this, I wondered if I could ask you about your podcast as we move into the last third of our conversation. Folks, I'm going to include in the notes for this discussion a link to the web page in general, but tell us about conscious conversations. What are you trying to, and I think you're in season 3 now. What are you
Mhm.
trying to do there in terms of maybe helping other people, us and yourself, to integrate, to understand these spiritual aspects, but also link them to the geopolitical? Because to me, it's those different levels that you're trying to tie together again in the search of integration, rather than allowing them to be kept separate, as they so often are academically, politically, and personally.
Mm. So I started Conscious Conversations just after I got initiated and in 2021. And when when I started doing research on what it meant to be a Sangoma, and I wanted to understand my experiences. So when I go into a trance, I wanted to understand what that happens. When I hear voices, I wanted to understand what that happens. But I also wanted to use the podcast as an educational platform and also a way to help other people who might be experiencing the same kind of, things I've experienced.
Mm,
In 2020, I decided to get a divorce. So as a young woman who had no intention of one day being a divorcee, realizing that, sure, this is not the kind of partnership I had hoped for. What did that mean? And as a person who largely grew up not really gravitating towards African spirituality and now experiencing it. And one of the reasons I did not gravitate towards African spirituality was because of how it was framed, right? So there are certain things I did not understand about how people could call themselves spiritual or sangomas, shamans, and their behavior didn't match that. Because for me, a healer, a shaman is something very sacred, right? And so in my community and as I grew up, I observed how some of the people were, and so I tried to disassociate myself from it.
mm,
I tried going through, the Christianity route. I went to a Lutheran church, and again there I saw the disconnect between people who call themselves Christians and their own behavior. I found it to be very hypocritical. um and for some reason I always just knew that Jesus didn't die for me, but that he was a brother and I had so much to learn from his ways and his understanding, right? So I had all these questions around. I did everything. I grew up in very challenging circumstances. I'd created a life for myself, um, married into a very well-off family, but there was something amiss. It didn't feel how I thought it would feel, right? And so I've always been the kind of person who is led by intuition. And so my instinct was, no, I don't want this life. I really don't want this life. There must be more. Companionship must mean something else. Success can't just be about living in a double-story house, in the best estate. It can't be about that. There must be more. And then on top of it, the lifestyle of it all, of middle class, the wine when you're cooking, the drama of it all. It was like, no, this can't be it. And so when my ancestors and I had a negotiation. So I had been told many years before I got initiated that I had the calling, but I always knew that if I have the calling, my ancestors will tell me directly. And so when I started having these life questions, I also went to therapy, and fortunately, my therapist had been initiated, a white woman, but she had been initiated by one of our greatest healers, Baba Credo Mutwa. And so her approach to therapy was very different, and she does what she calls soul integration therapy. And so through that, I started integrating my ancestors into my life. And it filled a void that all the material I had accumulated could not fill, right? And so in 2021, when I got initiated, I started doing the scientific research to understand what these experiences meant for me and how come it was that I had done everything and I had everything, but there was still something missing. And so my podcast became a tool for me to really speak to people I felt like understood some of the things I did not understand, but also could help me to clarify for other people who might be experiencing what I'm experiencing, to give them at least an alternative voice, things that are not in the mainstream. And so that is how Conscious Conversations really started. It's a platform for honest, authentic conversations. I'm cultivating a community for healing and brave conversations because sometimes we think of safety, and being brave and courageous does not guarantee our safety, because even after sharing our stories or being vulnerable, it doesn't mean the pain will go away. It doesn't mean we will be received how we hope to be received. And so creating this space, and the tools that can help other people. I also realized that not many people are as vocal as I am. And I think it has a lot to do with shame. Like I think when people attach a lot of shame to their experiences, then they hold back from talking about it. And I think this is how the system continues to manipulate and isolate people, right? When people are carrying the shame around things that have happened to them, then it separates them from community and potential healing and empathy and compassion, because they have not reconciled and made sense of their own experiences. So that is what Conscious Conversations is about. And now, with the planning of season 4, I'm actually looking at how I can create an educational community and platform that is more focused on Indigenous worldview, and connecting people from different cultures who share similar values, to share their stories and to speak about things that help them to grow and to deal with life. I find that education, with how it is right now, it's it's very sophisticated, right? And the language is often inaccessible to everyday people. Now, I want to bridge that. Yeah, it irritates me that certain things seem to only apply for certain people. I don't think that's how God meant for us to experience life. So yeah, that's why I do conscious
Got the
conversations.
podcast going. So I wanted to ask you a couple more questions and then conclude things by inviting you after those questions to add anything you might wish to what we've discussed. And that could involve going back over something we've touched on where you want to elaborate a bit more, or it might be new material. Does that sound all right as a means of drawing things to a close?
That's perfect.
Okay, so the first of my two questions is you've used some very powerful words in the last little while. Uh, trance, calling, initiation. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about those words and what they mean to you.
So I think our entire experience, our life experiences, I think we are constantly going through initiation. And because the mythology in life or the symbols has been removed from our modern lives, people struggle to make sense of their experiences, right? So how I've used my own life story to make sense of my lived experience and to imagine something different, because ordinarily people who grew up where I came from should not be where I am having this conversation with you. And so I had to find ways of making meaning of my life so that um, I can create a different meaning. So being part of the statistics, as a cultural studies professor, I'm sure you're very much aware of categories, statistics. My mother died of HIV/AIDS. I was sexually abused between 13 and 16. I grew up in a two-room shack in Kimberley. All these things. I had my first child at 19. All these things are things that should have kept my potential. And so if I did not believe in something beyond myself, I don't think I would be here. And I think many people have stopped believing in something greater than themselves. And that is why they do not have the capacity to fight for their lives. I don't think life is meant to be smooth sailing. I think challenges, even in African context or indigenous traditions, challenges are part of life. However, I do think that white supremacy and capitalism are what they're doing to people is so harmful. It's so harmful to the spirit that people are not able to harness their inner resources to cultivate a stronger sense of self, right?
Mhm.
All the people I look up to, some of the scholars I've read, they speak about different developmental stages, and I think that is normal. And in African traditions or indigenous cultures, people would have more resources to work through their identities and self-actualize and cultivate self-leadership within themselves, had it not been for this dominant culture, right? So that for me speaks to what initiation is. I think we go through different parts of initiation in our life. If we had the tools to understand and the cultural support, the traditional support to help us understand and make sense of the experiences we are going through within a community perspective and a broader perspective, I don't think people would be struggling the way that they are. But the system keeps people occupied with survival, and therefore they never get to a point where they are doing more than just surviving, right? The scarcity mentality that says I must take from you in order to be okay. The going against the body. So I believe that the body keeps the score. When you go against who you are as sovereign being, by manipulating and harming others, and others includes nature, then you are bound to self-destruct. And so that's how I think about initiation and shamanism in general. So I believe our lack of that understanding in our life is causing people a lot of harm.
And then my last question is getting back to racial issues. You've talked about whiteness and specifically Afrikaners, but you haven't mentioned the white liberal elite that often is of British background or Jewish background from other parts of Europe. And I wondered about the way in which you see it in the context of the Afrikaners, the supposed opponents of apartheid, but who were colonizers too, certainly the
Mm.
British.
Yeah, and you know, some of the scholars I follow, like Steve Biko, he often speaks of the English often pretending, or white elite pretending to be allies of you know, of us and our struggles, but not actually making or not being decisive about the ways in which they are going to support us in our quest for liberation. I think many white people who believe of themselves as, you know, liberals and for freedom, I think they just really talk a good talk. Because if it were not the case, we'll see people taking more radical and critical stances on oppression, right? We'd see a change in labor practices. We'd see a change in consumption practices. Like you look at how food systems have been dominated and actually changed um, by people who believe of themselves as liberals and not oppressive. For me, it makes me question a lot about what it is they actually mean. Steve Biko actually spoke about this kind of people who are not willing to sacrifice their comfort for the equality of all people. That for me is a problem. And I see it in these spaces that I recently find myself in. People who, when in conversation, you ask them, so in what ways do you relate to me, right? They call themselves conscious, aware, and they cannot share how being in relations with me for over a year, as an example, has helped to change their mindset. Now, if people cannot grow from each other's life experiences, if we cannot impact each other in those ways, then I feel like it defeats the purpose of ethical relationality. And when there is no ethical relationality, there cannot be equality or justice, right? Because my experiences should matter to you just as much as your experiences would matter to me. That would mean you actually see me, and that it is important to you that we interact at an equal level. And so I believe the world has a lot of work to do. People who call themselves liberals, the British, you know, the Jews in particular. In fact, you're reminding me of something. There's words for the genocide that has happened to the Jewish people, and yet there are no terms for what has happened to Africans. You know, so you ask yourself, even academics what have they been doing that they have not been able to come up with these theories or these words to attribute to the killings and continued rape of Africa and its people?
Thanks for that. And to conclude things, I'm wondering if there's something you'd like to add that goes back over what we've discussed, or something that we haven't touched on yet.
I would really like to invite people to reflect on who they are, to really take stock of what they say they stand for in relation to what they are willing to do for their beliefs. I've been reading Martin Luther King a lot. He's someone very special in my heart and in my spiritual practice. And he was killed, he was killed by a system that said they were okay with freedom and equality. But when he started realizing that white people in America actually did not want to change, then he became a threat to them. They speak about Martin Luther King in very soft, like black ways, but he had very specific, particular political views, and they don't speak about that. So the professors um, who are in charge of institutions, the CEOs of companies who are in charge of large finances or economics or resources, how are they actually making their decisions? When people continue to prioritize profit over people, how are people actually living in alignment with who they are? The alternative is for them to take down the curtain like Donald Trump and Elon Musk are doing, and to be who they are publicly, so that there isn't an illusion of alliance anywhere when people are actually not willing to give up what they have so that other people can have freedom.
It's interesting what you say about Martin Luther King, who, as you say, is revered in the United States, but in a very deracinated way that entirely neglects the fact that he had become a critic of capitalism, a critic of the Vietnam War, align with Malcolm X. And I think about the same thing with reference to Rosa Parks, who is also sanctified in white US culture. And nobody talks about the fact that she was connected to the Communist Party, which is where many of her ideas and her resistance had effects on others, and where organizational capacities were crucial. Instead, these people are sort of taken as black saints, right? Without any of the incredibly complex politics that they were part of really laid out.
Mm.
So it was very inspirational talking to you. I greatly appreciate it. All the best with season 4 of the podcast. I'm sure it'll be a rattling success. And I hope maybe sometime, perhaps with others that you work with, you might like to come back to the podcast, this one.
I'd love to, and possibly also have you on my podcast at some point. Yeah, I've been checking out some of your work and looking back at the lectures you did many years ago. You've been very much aware of, how the world operates, and have spoken against that. And I'm also very much aware that, some of these things, our positions and our ability to be vocal and clear about who we are and what we stand for comes with a lot of risk. A lot of risk of not being included, of not being tenured, and all of these things. But I strongly believe that the more of us continue to take these very clear stances, the more the system will cripple. I think if we can focus our energies and our mental focus on creating alternative systems and finding ways of cooperating, and bringing our efforts together, then we can actually have greater impact in the world.
That's a wonderful message of hope on which to finish things. Thank you so much for being with us. It's been wonderful having a chat with you.
Thank you for having me. I truly appreciate it, and I look forward to speaking to you again.